And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
All right, welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. Instead of going right to the Q&A, I'm going to do what we call Question of the Week. And when we do our Q&A, sometimes I do get a question that is so fantastic. Not that it's not something I haven't thought of before, but sometimes it's so fantastic that I'm like, wow, I could really sort of expand on this. And so this is a segment that we haven't done in a while. We do it every once in a while. Every blue moon, like I said, I get a question that simply just blows my fucking mind. But it's not a question that I haven't been asked before. It's a similar question, but one that has been phrased in a way that it just kind of blows my mind. And this week's question comes from the one and only Dean. Dean, the question machine. The question that he asked is, I want to know what would have happened if Vito Genovese lives and makes out of prison. Does he start a war with all the four families or just Carlo Gambino? Or would Carlo Gambino be too powerful by then to even be challenged because he has strong ties with Tommy Lucchese and so much influence over the other crime families? I'll read it once again. I want to know what would have happened if Vito Genovese lives and makes it out of prison. Does he start a war with all four families or just Carlo Gambino? Would Carlo Gambino be too powerful by then to be even challenged by Genovese because he has strong ties with Tommy Lucchese and so much influence over the other crime families? And the reason why this question is so good, congrats, Dean, you win an award. The reason why it's so good is because I never really thought about the consequences if Vito Genovese were to have gotten out of prison. It's just not something I sit back one day and go, I wonder if Vito got out of prison, what'd he do? I mean, I do have thoughts like that, don't get me wrong. But because the reality of what happened to Vito in prison, him dying in prison at a medical center in Missouri, you sort of don't play it out. And you guys know me. I don't like to play things out too far sometimes. But people always want me to play out the Salvi Testa shit. I don't understand that, but it is what it is. We know that Vito died behind a wall. We obviously know he didn't get out. But what if he did? And the first way to address this is to rehash history. So you guys are about to learn something. Some of it's going to sound very familiar to a lot of you. But as you know, going back to the days of the Castellammarese War, okay, Vito was instrumental, whether you realize it or not, in helping Luciano rid themselves of Salvatore Marazano. What many people may not realize is that Vito was side by side with Lucky Luciano on that. He helped him plot that murder. And it was actually Vito Genovese who put that hit squad together. However, as we know, Marazano called a meeting, and he called Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, and Frank Costello to a meeting. All three of them knew they were never leaving that meeting alive. They knew they would be killed, and they decided to act first. And we know eventually that they would then go to Masseria's side, and then they would take off his head as well. So in 1937, Vito Genovese flees New York City, fearing that he's going to be indicted for murder, and takes off and goes to Italy. Now, with Vito Genovese back in Italy, Frank Costello was named the new boss. In 1945, Vito Genovese would end up back in New York City and would be indicted for the murder of Ferdinand Baccia. The information that law enforcement had received was actually supplied by a mob rat by the name of Ernest the Hawk Rupolo. Genovese would plead not guilty to that murder, and shortly after, another witness, a guy by the name of Jerry Esposito, who was planning on testifying against Vito Genovese, was found in New Jersey on the side of the road with two in the back of his fucking head. Vito was very good about silencing people that were going to testify. That was sort of his MO. Now, law enforcement had another witness who they put into protective custody for his own safety, but it didn't work because someone whacked Peter LaTempa in his cell. He was under protective custody, and Vito Genovese was still able to get to him. The good old days. With two witnesses unable to corroborate the testimony of Rupolo, the judge tossed the case. Vito walks. So it's weird when we talk about the spoke in the wheel of things, because if Genovese gets convicted of that, he would have gotten the death penalty, 100%. That was going to be on the table. So with that behind him, Vito Genovese wanted his power back. Had Genovese never fled to Italy, he likely would have been named boss of the Luciano crime family, but without him, Castello absorbed what was left, flanked by Willie Moretti, who was Frank Sinatra's cousin, by the way. Genovese wanted his power back, but Castello and Moretti were not going to budge an inch. A few months later came the infamous meeting in Cuba. Vito Genovese called a private meeting with Luciano when he asked Luciano to retire and hand him the leadership. Luciano became irate and almost beat Vito Genovese to death. It took a week before Genovese could walk so he could get back on the plane and go home. In Genovese's mind, that was it. Genovese, through channels, had the United States government informed that Luciano was 90 miles from the shores of the United States in Cuba. It was a move designed to get Luciano away from American shores and force him back to Italy so that Genovese could create a hostile takeover, which is what he wanted to do. The United States government would step in and they would tell Cuba, either you get rid of Luciano or we're not sending you medical supplies anymore. Cuba relied on the United States for medical supplies and other goods, and so what do? They expel Luciano back to Italy, essentially rendering him persona non grata in terms of power. Genovese plotted, he schemed, and he began to whisper campaign. We've talked about this before. Genovese was going to kill Willie Moretti. That was the first person he was going to kill. But it turns out he really didn't need to, because Moretti, who had become a liability due to his ramblings at the Kefauver hearings, was sentenced to death by the commission, who feared he had gone absolutely fucking crazy. He had syphilis and was rambling and saying crazy shit at this hearing, and the mob says, no, he's got to go. And that's what happened. So Genovese didn't have to move on him. And a result of that is Castello names Vito Genovese his new underboss. But that wasn't enough for Vito. Vito wanted full control of the family. And as we've talked about before, Genovese wants to overthrow the powerhouses of the commission. He knows in order to get that done, he needs an ally. And that comes in the form of Carlo Gambino. And to simplify it all, the agreement was if Carlo goes along with turning his head the other way, Genovese would kill Castello and in turn help kill Anastasia, naming himself boss of the Luciano crime family, and then he would elevate Gambino to be the new boss of the Anastasia crime family. Carlo agrees, but he had his own concerns. But Vito was prepared for all eventualities. But the mistake that Vito Genovese makes is thinking that he could render Castello and Luciano ineffectual. Castello survives the attempted hit by Vinny the Chin Gigante in 1957, and he sees the writing on the wall and retires. He could have buried Genovese and Gigante at the trial, but he refused to name anybody. Nope, don't recognize anybody here. And what happens at the end of that trial? Gigante looks over and goes, "Thanks, Frank." That's old school shit. Soon after that, Anastasia gets clipped, and Carlo absorbs the Anastasia crime family, renaming it the Gambino crime family. Now, the one mistake that Vito made was fully trusting Carlo Gambino. Gambino had ambitions far beyond just becoming boss of his own family. And as a result, in 1958, Carlo worked with Luciano and Castello to frame Genovese for a bad drug deal. Gambino paid a known drug dealer by the name of Nelson Cantaloupes $100,000 to falsely implicate Genovese in a drug deal. April 4th of 59, Genovese gets indicted. April 17th of 59, Genovese gets sentenced to 15 years in prison and gets shipped off to Atlanta. Even behind the wall, Vito was having guys clipped back in New York without hesitation. Anybody he thought he was involved, he had killed. You either looked at him sideways or even talked subversive, he was going to have you killed. Anyone that he, like I said, he felt that had anything to do with him getting fucked over, he would wipe off the map. At the time Vito enters prison, he's 61 years old. He knew full well he was set up, and I imagine he knew who was behind that. The streets always talk. They always have. And I would suspect that Vito Genovese was a little bit beyond fucking irate. By federal guidelines, keep in mind, the 85% rule is today. So if you get sentenced to federal prison, you have to do 85% of your time. It wasn't like that in the 60s and 70s. So Vito likely would have done 11 years max of a 15-year stretch, maybe 11 and a quarter, okay? However, in 1969, at age 71, he dies of a massive heart attack in Missouri at the medical center. He had done 10 years, 6 months, and he was almost out. He was almost home free. So we go back to the question that Dean asked. What would happen if Vito lives and makes it out of prison? Does he start a war with all 4 families or just Gambino? Or would Carlo Gambino have been too powerful? And did he have too strong a ties with Tommy Lucchese? So let's address the Tommy Lucchese thing first. Yeah, while it's true that Carlo and Tommy Lucchese created a juggernaut team together in power and influence, Lucchese dies in 1967. So whatever power base that Carlo Gambino and Lucchese had begun was just no longer existent. Gambino, with the death of Tommy Lucchese, became the most powerful mob boss in American history. Now, as for the Colombos, keep in mind, while Vito Genovese is in Atlanta, all hell breaks loose within the Colombo crime family. From 1960 to 63, the Colombos would go to war with themselves. Then in 1963, Joe Bonanno tries to pull the coup of a lifetime by getting Joe Magliocco to go along with taking out the entire commission. Obviously, we know that doesn't work because the contracts were handed to Joe Colombo, who was more than a prolific hitman for the Colombo crime family. And what does he do? He turns and he tells Gambino and the commission of what the plot was behind their backs. As a result, Bonanno takes off to Montreal, and Magliocco is left to fend for himself. Magliocco admits his role, and more or less he's fined and thrown out of the Mafia. Bonanno was thrown out of the Mafia as well. For his honesty, Colombo is handed the reins and named boss of the Profaci crime family, and he changes the name to the Colombo crime family. As we know, Joe Colombo quickly becomes a thorn in the side of Carlo Gambino and other bosses for his Italian-American Civil Rights League bullshit. Now, keep in mind, Joe Colombo was 41 years old at the time that he rose to boss of that family, the youngest American mob boss ever. Now, if you do the math here, right, Vito Genovese, who dies in 1969, would have probably likely been released in 1970. That makes things really interesting for a lot of different reasons. So, let's say Vito exits prison in 1970. He would have been 72 years old. With Lucchese's death in 67, that would have made Vito the second most powerful mob boss in the Mafia. Think about it. He knows Carlo was behind the bullshit. He knows all too well who was behind it, the mechanism for it. The one thing Vito always wanted was to be the boss of bosses. So he exits prison and he sees that Colombo is having his own problems. He knows Bonanno has been exiled, and he knows that Bonanno tried to pull the coup and killed the whole commission. Vito would have been in a great position exiting prison, considering that Lucchese was already in the ground 2 years. So what does Vito do? Well, let's play it out for a second. Number one, he knows Carlo is behind the setup. Now, he could easily approach Colombo and explain that it would be beneficial for Colombo to align with him just for safety reasons. He could then approach Joe Bonanno and discuss the issues that Bonanno had with Carlo Gambino. So Genovese could essentially align with Joe Bonanno, Joe Colombo, and then it would be Bonanno, the Bonanno crime family, the Genovese crime family, the Colombo crime family, and the Gambino versus the Gambino and Lucchese crime family. 3 against 2. And we got to be honest. If you're going to take the Bonannos, the Colombos, and the Genovese versus the Gambino and Lucchese's, the other 3 are going to win. Gambinos and Lucchese's don't stand a chance because the Bonanos, the Genoveses, and the fucking Colombos were shooters. They were killers. Now, while this all sounds good on paper, I cannot see Vito aligning with Colombo, considering that he's drawing, horrid attention to himself. But I could kind of see Vito fully fooling Colombo into believing that Vito was on his side. Remember, Vito was a Machiavellian motherfucker. He really was. So there's two main questions that we have to ask. Would the Luccheses have backed Carlo, suspecting three other families had aligned against them? The second one is, would Vito have attempted to take out Carlo Gambino for what he did? So if you're Vito, the first order of business has to be aligned with Joe Colombo. Trick him into aligning with you, and then get together with Joe Bonanno, allow him back into the Mafia, back into the fray, under the guise of removing Gambino from power, which Bonanno would have been all for. Trust me. We do know that Gambino had become very insanely powerful, but losing Tommy Lucchese, while it enhanced the Gambino's family power, it also hurt Gambino at the same time. It would not have taken very much for the Luccheses, specifically Carmine Tramunti, to be ushered to the Genovese side of the fence. And it would really wouldn't matter in the long run, because Carmine Tramunti would head to the can in 1973, and then Tony Dux Corallo would take over 73-74. So with Corallo's mentality of overexpansion and bullying techniques, I can see where he might be swayed by Vito Genovese to move on Carlo Gambino. So it's not impossible to believe that Genovese might have been able to sway four families to align against Gambino. It's just not impossible. You can't say that couldn't have been a reality. Now, some of you may say, well, Carlo was smarter than that, and he would have foresaw that coming a million miles away. Well, you can see that coming a million miles away, but if you can't stop it, what can you really do? And I think we can all agree that Carlo was no dummy by any stretch of the imagination, but he might have been left in a position where he might have had to concede certain things to Vito Genovese. So let's pretend Genovese aligns Joe Colombo, Joe Bonanno, Carmine Tramunti of the Luccheses, and he uses Colombo just for a power's sake. But behind the curtain agrees to terms with Colombo getting killed. So he uses Colombo, align with me. He does. Now it's four families versus one. And he goes along with Joe Colombo getting killed because he really wants him out of the way anyway. But he uses Colombo's ego to his advantage. 1971 to 73, the Colombos had four different fucking acting bosses: Joe Iacovelli, Vincent Alloy, Joe Brancato. And according to the FBI, it wasn't until 73 that Carmine Persico takes over. But I think it was prior to 73 on the streets. That's just my opinion. I could be wrong, but that's just sort of my gut feeling that it was a little bit before that. So there's obviously a lot of missing parts in that. But to address the question, the Luccheses were somewhat unstable. Not the Luccheses. The Colombos for a while were pretty unstable. Carmine would have been all for that. Are you kidding me? But to address the question, I think with Tommy Lucchese in the dirt, Gambino does become the most powerful boss. But in reality, if Genovese does get out, you had better bet that murder was going to be on the table. Now, some might say there is no way Genovese can pull that off, but I totally disagree with that idea. Knowing what Genovese wanted, and I can say that considering that we do know that what Genovese does in 1957 with Albert Anastasia and trying to kill Costello, and knowing what Joe Bonanno wanted, I think Genovese was smart enough to get that done, if that's what he wanted. Do I think he pulls off killing Gambino? No, absolutely not. Because that would have brought in Buffalino, Trafficante, it would have created a lot of other problems. But do I think that he can render Gambino or put him into a situation where he has to step back a little bit and let go of some of his power? Abso-fucking-lutely. Abso-fucking-lutely. It doesn't mean that Genovese succeeds completely, because I think eventually Gambino was smart enough to get around him. But let's imagine that everything goes down exactly the way that I said it would. Genovese would have become the most powerful boss just by aligning himself with other people. And let's imagine he does that and continues to live until 1976. He would have been 79 years old in 1976 when Carlo Gambino dies. It would have meant, with Gambino dead, he would have become the most powerful boss in New York City and in the United States, which is what he always fucking wanted. He had it for about 4.5 hours in upstate New York in 1957 at that meeting. And that would have changed the entire trajectory of the Gambino crime family for decades. John Gotti never would have been him. Never. Paul Castellano might not have even taken over, because Vito Genovese would have sided with people that he thought he could bend. So one never knows. And then we could play off that smoke and say, well, what if Neil Della Croce becomes boss? Then what happens? That's crazy. But I think that move also would have changed the Genovese crime family trajectory as well. So do I think Genovese would have gone to war? In some ways, yes. But in actuality, no, I don't think so. The amount of bloodshed, it just would have been too much for the city. And it would have destroyed the Mafia, let's just be honest. And I think understanding Vito's way of handling things, killing Gambino was probably on his wish list, but I just think it would have gone, I just don't think it would have gone down that way. Vito likely might have tried, but I think the reality of that and Gambino's style of sitting back and observing would have probably forced Genovese to make a stupid move, or Gambino would have lulled him to sleep and taken advantage of it. Agreeing with whatever and then back channeling his desires to decapitate Genovese. The thing about challenging anyone at the head of the table is that those surrounding him have to be snakes. They have to have their own desires for power. Loyalty in that sense isn't something provided, especially if there is more to gain by killing the hen. So in my opinion, it's not that Gambino had too much power and that everybody was loyal. I just think the reality is if Genovese could have corralled alignment with 4 other families, it's a different story. He could have at least evened things up with Gambino in terms of power. But knowing Genovese, there was no fucking way he was going to have allowed or wanted to allow Gambino to breathe, because it always meant trouble. It would always mean trouble. But if Vito could have aligned the 4 families versus Carlo Gambino, that would have crippled Gambino because the commission votes would go against him. And that's how you would have controlled Gambino, through commission votes. That's how you control anybody in those days. That's the only way. And I think Vito would have known that. So if you guys want to reach out to me at mobtalkradioshow@gmail.com, give me your synopsis of how and what would have gone down had Vito Genovese gotten out of prison. Oh, it would have been fireworks in somebody's asshole and bottle rockets in the eye sockets pretty quick. I'm telling you. Anyway, we'll be back on Mob Talk Radio, where we're going to start the Q&A portion of the show.